Hello, folks, and thank you guys for checking out our 2020 annual meeting this year via PowerPoint. My name is Dana Boyle, and I'm president of the Northern Neck Vegetable Growers Association, and I welcome you. We would love to be able to be with you all this year in person to fellowship and have lunch together and all that fun stuff. But since that could not happen, I will instead take this time to thank our extension agents, Stephanie and Trent, for putting together this information pack program. For those of you joining us that are not members of the Northern Neck Vegetable Growers Association, please consider contacting me or one of our members or uh, one of our extension agents to find out more about our educational programs, our educational trips, our scholarship, and more. We'd love to share more information with you about our fun association. At this time, I'd like to thank our sponsors shown on your screen for their support of our 2020 annual meeting. Please fill out your survey at the end of the presentation to have your name entered into a drawing to win a gift card sponsored by these businesses.
Hello, this is Tom Kuhar, Virginia Tech entomologist, and this talk is on pest management for cucurbit crops. Well, let's first start talking about one of the most recognizable pests of cucurbit crops, and that is the cucumber beetles. Seems like as soon as you plant your cucurbit crops and the seedlings or the transplants are put into the ground, it seems like these beetles just show up out of nowhere. Cucumber beetles have spend the winter overwintering as an adult, and they're either in the woods under some litter and no-till fields or in some grassy ditch areas, but they spend the winter as an adult, and then they show up, it seems like, as soon as those cucurbit crops are in the ground. Beetles have a way to aggregate based on a male aggregation pheromone, which is extremely potent. A single male will land on a plant and give off this pheromone, which basically calls in all his buddies, and males and females, and they come to not only that field, but sometimes a single plant, and they will wreak havoc on it, feeding like crazy, and that's when a lot of damage, actually death to seedlings, can occur during that stage. One interesting note about the cucumber beetle pheromone and the way that they communicate with this aggregation pheromone is that scientists have been able to identify the compounds that are involved in this aggregation, and they've actually made or synthesized lures that can be used in various pest management ways. One, to monitor that beetles are actually active on your farm, which can alert you to control tactics that are needed. But two, it's possible to maybe trap these beetles out in some situations, and that way alleviate the need for putting an insecticide on a crop. We're not there yet. This technology for the synthesized pheromone has just come around recently, but it could be a wave of the future of having maybe toxic baits that are put out where you're basically killing beetles and not having to spray fields. But again, this is not something that's ready yet. This is just wanted to alert you to some research that's going on in the US. So probably one of the more popular ways of controlling cucumber beetles is the use of foliar insecticides, and most commonly it's going to be pyrethroids, and there are a large number of products that are available for vegetable crops, including cucurbits, and you see the list right there. Because there's so many, and so many of these have gone generic, the prices of pyrethroids are very, very cheap, and growers tend to use these, and they are very effective at killing cucumber beetles. The problem is the plant keeps growing. There's some unprotected areas on the foliage as the plant continues to grow, and beetles continue to reinvade the field. So often multiple applications are needed of these insecticides. In the 1990s, growers found out a much easier and in a lot of ways more effective way of controlling cucumber beetles, and that is through the use of systemic neonicotinoids. These insecticides, such as Admire Pro, Platinum Venom, just to name a few, can be applied to the soil as a soil drench or to the roots or to seeds. And because they're xylem mobile, they can be taken up by the roots and moved to the green tissue of the plant, where they are very, very toxic to cucumber beetles as well as some other insects. And this has been worked extremely well for cucumber beetles. The slide here shows why it works so well, and that is because of the fact that beetles will aggregate on plants, and it is very difficult to spray them with a foliar, as we had first talked about. But what if you kill those first beetles that land on the plants? Well, the best way to do that is with a protective systemic insecticide that the plant will take up. So this slide shows a insecticide trial that was conducted on the eastern shore of Virginia, and in this one we applied the systemic insecticide Admire through drip chemigation. We were growing melon plants, Gallia melons, which were highly susceptible to bacterial wilt. It actually kills the whole plants when the vines begin to run. Well, the plants get bacterial wilt from cucumber beetle feeding early on. So it's the young plants that when they get cucumber beetles, they get this bacteria transmitted to them, and it kills the plant later. This slide shows either Admire put through drip chemigation versus actually 6 insecticide applications of a pyrethroid, Baythroid. And this just shows the numbers of beetles that were found on there, and just getting excellent control from, well, both the multiple sprays of pyrethroids, but also just that single injection of the neonicotinoid. And then later just showing the percentage of plants that died from bacterial wilt. It's tremendous impact on this crop that was very susceptible to this disease. So this slide is just an indication of how well the neonicotinoids work. Another way of delivering neonicotinoids is through seed treatments. Particularly if you're growing much larger cucurbits like pumpkins and squash, but it's also available on cucumbers and some others. But you can actually buy the seed pre-treated. A lot of growers have been doing this for a few years now, and Farmore FI 400 is probably the most popular one. And this seed treatment insecticide is relatively cheap. It really costs not that much more when you buy your seed to have it on there. It has 3 fungicides, which can help withstand emergence. You're probably going to get some seeds that are going to die possibly and not make it. So the fungicides will help. And then it's got the neonicotinoid thiamethoxam, which is going to give you about 21 days or 3 weeks of protection against cucumber beetle. Excellent protection. This slide kind of shows that. This is data that is part of a multi-state team that looked at this seed treatment Farmore when it first came out. It was actually experimental then when we did the work. And throughout the mid-Atlantic U.S., we planted both untreated seed and then seed that had the thiamethoxam, and we all assessed how much damage occurred to these cucurbit crops, but we also pulled or excised leaves from the field and actually put beetles on them to see how long these seed treatments last. And across the board, across all locations, we found that it's about 3 weeks. It's only going to give you 3 weeks. After that time, it is not going to protect the plants against these beetles anymore. So I guess in summary, it seems like if you are okay with using neonics, which means there are no restrictions on you using them, you'll be able to sell them to your final market. That seems to be a really clear-cut, easy way to get nice preventative insurance against a tough insect that's hard to control otherwise, these cucumber beetles. So if you do use either some kind of a drench of a neonicotinoid or the seed treatments, the next question is, all right, what do you need to deal with pests? Well, you might hold back on those pyrethroids. I know they're cheap, but there's some things to think about. One, do you really need them if the plants are growing and they're fruiting? So if you can get 3 weeks of protection, do you really need to start coming in with pyrethroid sprays? And the question is, well, it depends what's out there on those plants, but probably cucumber beetles aren't going to hurt you then. There's been research that have shown that defoliation, that most of the defoliation that impacts these crops occurs really early in their growth stage, which the neonic is going to protect against. And also that beetles in the flowers may actually help with some of the pollination. So here's a study that was done, some research that was done in Cornell University, and they basically showed that mid-season plants can tolerate up to about 25% of their defoliation of their leaf area removed before it actually impacts yield of these things. So that's a lot of defoliating, and when these plants are growing vigorously, it's hard for cucumber beetles to actually reach that level. So there are thresholds that could tell you when you possibly might need that spray, and it's roughly about 1 beetle per plant when the plants are really small, but when they get some size to them, it actually exceeds 5 beetles per plant. So then here's the other thing to consider, particularly when you're growing cucurbit plants where you need insects to pollinate in order to get fruit, and that is, do you really want to be putting something out there on those plants when you need pollination to occur as well? So that is definitely something to think about. One, you got all those bees that are visiting the flowers, and pyrethroids are toxic to the bees. But a beetle in a flower, everyone should know that there has been research that have shown that that cucumber beetle is not hurting you and actually might be helping you when these beetles tend to go into the flowers. And they really love pollen. They love cucurbit pollen more than anything. So when the plants start flowering, producing male flowers, the beetles are going to tend to go to those flowers, and they're actually going to pollinate the plant, and they're not going to hurt you. So I did all the discussing on, do you really need those pyrethroid sprays? And well, when I said it depends, this is one of the things that may change your decision making, and that is if squash bugs show up, and they tend to come a little bit later in the plant growth stages of the cucurbits, and there's a shot of the adult female laying some eggs, and then they start out a little greenish and they become gray as they mature. These nymphs. The feeding from squash bugs can actually cause wilting of the plant. You see the drying of the leaf. Their piercing, sucking feeding can actually kill the cells of those leaves. We saw so many in 2020 this summer that they actually killed zucchini plants. There was enough squash bug feeding on them that the plant actually gave up, wilted, and died. I had never seen it before, and it was totally from squash bug feeding. So these bugs can cause significant injury to the plants. Another thing I saw in 2020 that I was not convinced that squash bugs were damaging to the fruit. I thought they tended to feed on the leaves and stems, and that's how they're hurting the plants. But here's some shots showing these are the smallest instars, or the tiniest of the nymphs of squash bugs, and you see on the bottom right, that's the squash bug nymphs on a zucchini, and then the top left is the feeding injury from their stylets that are poking into that fruit. And maybe just a tiny bit of this, that fruit is probably still able to be sold, but when you get it looking like the one on the top left, that's just too much injury. That's an ugly fruit, and you're probably not going to be able to sell it. So this injury happens to any of the cucurbits, and bottom line, squash bugs are probably something that we need to control. And here's another one. Again, I've basically told you all these reasons why you probably shouldn't be using the pyrethroids on cucumber beetle, and now I'm saying that you need to see what else is out there. Squash bugs are one, but two or 3 years in a row now, we have had problems with this insect. These came from 2020. So this was pumpkins and squash. And they have a tiny little hole that you find in the fruit. It is a perfectly round hole, less than the diameter of a pencil, but it's perfectly round, and sometimes you will see sawdust-like frass coming out of that hole. And this is made by pickleworm. And Pickleworm is a tropical moth that we have not really dealt with for the longest time. I've been an entomologist in Virginia working on vegetables for 20 years now, and most of my career I have not dealt with this insect, not even seen it. And then all of a sudden I've dealt with it for 3 years in a row now. And it is a tropical insect that we will maybe or maybe not get moths making their way to Virginia sometime in the summer. And a lot of this depends on storm fronts that are able to kind of transport these moths fast enough to get them to Virginia, to where once you get the moths flying around and you see the top right corner is one, that's a female pickleworm moth. These are kind of smaller moths, but you can see them. If you see them in your field, that's what they are. They will lay their eggs on flowers. The larvae will begin feeding in the flower tissue, and then you'll see a hole bored out of the flower you see on the bottom left. And then the pickleworm will then move into fruit, where they will bore in, come out, and then bore another hole into the fruit, and usually leave that fruit to where it's not marketable anymore. We have seen this 3 years in a row, like I'm saying, and it is an insect that we need to be on the lookout for. Some negative things here is there is no pheromone that works for these moths, and they're also not drawn to lights, so we can't use any kind of black light trap or anything. So we don't have an effective way of monitoring whether we happen to have this moth or not in Virginia. The only thing we can go by is an alert that we are starting to see them, and then basically send out an alert through extension agents and other grower alerts that, hey, we've got pickleworm again this year. And we did that in 2020, actually. My grad student, Sean Boyle, he found pickleworm in yellow summer squash. And this was, at the time, we thought one of the first sightings of it. This was in early August, and we found them in the summer squash. And we sent an alert out to extension agents. Well, it turned out that the same week that we had saw that, a couple other people had some sightings of it as well. So I think the way to go is that across the state, we're going to need to monitor for this insect, and when it shows up, to alert growers that it's out there, and I would spray at that point. And some things that you could possibly spray, well, this is a pickleworm insecticide trial that was conducted on the eastern shore of Virginia this year in 2020. And what it looked at was some insecticides that are relatively IPM friendly, like Proclaim Opti, Coragen, which is a diamide, Radiant, which is a spinosyn. Harvanta is also another diamide insecticide. And these are all insecticides that aren't toxic to bees or some of the other things, and they're a little bit more IPM friendly, and they're very effective against pickleworm. As you see in the slide, we've got percent damage, fruit damage there to the right. We had about 16% of our zucchini damaged in the untreated check, compared with one application of these insecticides. So there's a lot of insecticides that work well for pickleworm, but so do pyrethroids, and they work extremely well against this insect. So some of the pros compared to the ones that I had just run through with pyrethroids are that they are a heck of a lot cheaper, they are effective, and they actually control cucumber beetles and squash bugs as well, if they happen to be on that crop late season. So this may be a good option for using pyrethroids, is if you have pickleworm. However, there's some negative effects of these pyrethroids, and that's that they are toxic to natural enemies, which can help keep things like aphids in check, and that when you spray them, you may end up having an aphid outbreak that you have to deal with. This slide shows something that happened to us this year, and happens to us quite often, and happens to a lot of growers, and that is melon aphid outbreaks occurring often sometime in the summer, usually in the month of August, after usually more than one pyrethroid application have occurred on the crop. And you just basically wipe out the natural enemies. Melon aphid is resistant to pyrethroids, and they will just absolutely explode through asexual reproduction. And have so many on the leaves that their honeydew from their sugary excrement ends up on the fruit. Sooty mold grows on it, and you end up with a serious problem on your hands. No one wants to buy those pumpkins. So this is a problem. Aphid problems are brought on by the use of pyrethroids. The problem is we have some insects now that pyrethroids might be the best solution. So this is a kind of the decision making for the grower, and I'll basically lay it out. Say you get pickleworm late season. You don't have anything else out there. What are you going to do? Well, as I showed you in that slide, there's a lot of insecticides that provide very good control of pickleworm and don't destroy natural enemies. They're IPM friendly. You probably won't have an aphid problem if you use them. Those include like Coragen, a diamide, Radiant, and all the ones listed here. That is an option. Another option is you spray your pyrethroid, but then you got to throw in something that might control those aphids because you're going to possibly flare them by spraying that pyrethroid. So what can you use? There's a lot of options for that. This slide shows all these products have been tested. I won't show you a bunch of slides of efficacy trials. I can just promise you everything listed on this slide works extremely well at controlling aphids. So if these were included in the tank mix, you would get aphid control along with the pyrethroid that's going to kill pickleworm or anything else. And then finally, a third option is possibly spraying a product that kills everything. And we do have some products that are registered on cucurbit crops that have a pretty broad spectrum and including aphids. So things like the Harvanta, which is a diamide, actually provides efficacy against a lot of insects, including pickleworm, Thorax, another one. Indigo ZC, by the way, is a neonicotinoid plus a pyrethroid in one product. So that one would get both your aphids, and then it has the pyrethroid in there for everything else. So I just laid out a lot of different options, and it's really up to the grower to decide what's the best way to go and what insecticides they might want to put out. So that wraps up this talk on cucurbit pest management. Hopefully you got a good update for this year and what to know with this coming year in 2021. Just some take-home messages. Starting with a seed treatment like Farmore FI 400 that has a neonicotinoid in there will provide you some great early season control of cucumber beetles. I didn't mention it in this talk, but it will also improve your stand when you plant with these seed treatments. Foliar insecticides may not be needed for a good portion of the pumpkin or whatever your cucurbit crop is. You may have a whole stretch in there where you don't have to worry about insects. In fact, let the pollinators do what they're going to do. Your crop is looking good, especially when it's flowering. That's probably not a good time to be spraying. Be cautious when using the pyrethroids. A lot of growers use them, and there's good reasons too. But the aphid flare issue is something we see over and over, and it is a problem that you probably don't want to be dealing with. So if you can avoid using them, I would hold off. I didn't mention this with squash bugs, but the time to spray them is when you see those gray nymphs. Not before, not when you see an adult laying eggs, not when you just see eggs. The reason is because a lot of those eggs may be parasitized, giving rise to a parasitic wasp that will go around and parasitize more squash bug eggs. So none of those eggs ended up becoming squash bug nymphs. So also, none of the insecticides are going to penetrate the egg chorion and actually kill the egg. So an egg may take a week to hatch. If you spray when you just see eggs, you're not going to kill anything because the eggs haven't hatched yet, and they may be hatching into a parasitoid that's a beneficial insect. So you should hold off until you actually see squash bugs. Need to watch out for pickleworms. These things come a little bit later, probably in the month of August. And if there is an alert going out that we have pickleworm, then it may be time to come in with some of these insecticides, because there's no good way of monitoring for these insects. and that may be the time that you actually use the pyrethroid. So that's all I've got. Thank you very much.
Please take a moment to complete the brief survey linked below. Your responses will give us a better understanding of how we are doing and how we may better serve your needs in the future. To access the survey, you may scan the QR code on the left using your smartphone's camera or QR code scanning app, or enter the link on the right into your internet browser. Those who complete the survey have the opportunity to enter a raffle for the chance to win a Visa gift card provided by our generous sponsors. Thank you.